Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Leading Together podcast, Insights for Delaware's Tomorrow. In each episode, we sit down with Delaware's top minds and leaders to share perspectives that help advance FSE's mission, which is to build capacity, raise awareness, and elevate school board leadership across our communities. And today, I have the great good fortune to introduce you to Andrew Moe Hoffman. Andrew is a seasoned professional in undergraduate admissions and access to higher education. He has an extensive background, and he currently serves as the Director of College Partnerships at Matriculate. And the goal there is to foster strategic partnerships that help first generation and low income students navigate the admissions process, which we all know is very, very complicated. So before joining Matriculate, Dr. Hoffman was the director of admissions at Swarthmore College, which is a fabulous institution. And he held the position of assistant dean of admissions and the director of access programming. So I'm really excited for this conversation because he's got a perspective that I think will be really, really helpful for everyone who's concerned about K-12 education in Delaware, which is our focus at FSE, because it's really the end of the pipeline to be able to see sort of what we're doing now. And he's going to be able to help us understand from his perspective what he's seen. But he focuses on promoting diversity, inclusion, and access in the admissions process. So he got his bachelor's at Arizona State University and his master's from Vanderbilt and his EDD from the University of Pennsylvania. And his research focuses on LGBTQ plus students and providing insights to help shape institutional policy. So Andrew, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your work. It means a lot to me personally because I struggled and I know what that's like to be someone trying to navigate, higher ed from a different perspective. So I'm very grateful for you to be here and for the work that you do and for sharing your insights with us.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. So, all right, let's start with maybe a bit of your journey. Let's talk to the audience about, how'd you become interested in admissions?
Yeah, so I appreciate you having me speak to folks in Delaware. This is my now chosen state. So I did not grow up here. I'm a first generation college student. I was low income in the college process, and I grew up in a small town in Wisconsin. And it's called Janesville. It's part of the Rust Belt. We were funded and run on General Motors. My parents and grandparents worked in the factories on the line. And so I saw that growing up. I saw really hardworking folks working with their hands. And that was something that I wanted to do something a little different than that. I was pretty interested in the policy and advocacy, and as a student growing up, I really thought about what were some other opportunities out there. A lot of my friends were from the same kind of working class backgrounds. It did feel like everyone else had a little bit more money than we did, and had a little bit more knowledge. And so I sort of grappled with that as sort of that imposter syndrome growing up. But specifically being a gay kid in small town Wisconsin, I wanted to get out. I wanted to explore the world and be in a bigger environment where I just felt a little bit more included. This was in the late 90s and early 2000s, so kind of a different time at that point. So I went to my school counselor and I said, I'm interested in going out of state. And she's a lovely person, helpful in a lot of ways. College guidance was not one of them. And she said, there's a big book of colleges in the counseling office, have at it. I had known nothing about going out of state. Almost everyone, if you go to college in my high school, goes in state. And so that's what I did. I sort of carved my own path. I was really involved in Key Club, which is a national service organization in high school. And I was able to fundraise and go to this conference in Orlando. And I remember distinctly on stage, there was an award presentation for the seniors, and they were all getting scholarships to college. And that was a very pivotal core memory for me because I said, as a freshman in high school, I'm going to get one of those. I don't know how, I don't know where I'm going to go, but I'm going to get money for college because it was so pivotal to my family. And so worked through the course of high school, became governor of Wisconsin, Upper Michigan for Key Club, and sort of on the national stage. And I got one of the 4 out-of-state scholarships to Arizona State. So my college search process was really different. I didn't choose a college based on the college, actually. I based it entirely on affordability. And luckily, it was an amazing experience for me and so right in so many ways. I just didn't really know that in high school. And then I kind of fell into admissions. I was really involved in college. I was involved in student government, and I was a tour guide for the admissions office. I was a political science and journalism major, and so I thought, okay, I did some political stuff in high school. Political science majors become lawyers. Like I
Right, that's the path.
comprehensive career search, and I went to my mentor, who I worked for. She's a senior vice president at ASU. And I said, I want to go to law school. And I said, can you please write a letter of recommendation? She's like, of course, absolutely. But why do you want to go to law school? And I did not have a very good answer, quite honestly, for that question. She's like, I don't think that this is your path. And I think that you should go into higher education. You seem really involved in college, admissions and enrollments and all of these things that we do. And so that's what I did. I applied to master's degree programs. I went to Vanderbilt, got into plenty, went to Vanderbilt for a master's degree. And then this was during the 08-09 financial crisis.
Sure.
And I started applying to jobs, many jobs back then. And I knew I wanted to work in the university environment. And there's a saying in higher ed, when the going gets tough for economic reasons, there are two main offices that stay open. They stay the course when it comes to hiring. It's fundraising and admission. And they need to keep the lights on that way. And so there was a position open in admissions, and I became an admissions officer at Vanderbilt and had just an incredible early career learning a lot about admissions. I learned about it in my coursework, but I didn't know all of those pieces. In admissions, you're doing data analysis and marketing and communications and building relationships and traveling. And I got to travel to so many different countries and states and all these things. And it really was a very good foundational job in my early career, and kind of just fell into college admissions that way.
Interesting. So, I mean, I think that it's for me a perceivable and almost palpable that you do have this love of higher ed, and I think there's something. It's the pursuit of knowledge, the learning, the environment. I think all of that's great, and it's wonderful to have that your path led you to something that was sort of like internally consistent.
Yep.
So what are the big takeaways though from admissions? Like, you were there. I mean, how I can't imagine how many students' lives you've touched.
Yeah, thousands. I mean, I like to think that I was such a difference maker and change maker, but students are doing this also on their own, and so I'm a part of this process. But I think in my career, I have learned a lot about systems, and I've learned a lot about equity. I think those are two main areas, right? So the university itself is a system, and we affect, policy changes at the institutional level. And so dealing with institutional priorities, what's important to a place like Vanderbilt or Swarthmore or Yale or Princeton or Penn State or whatnot, and how do you implement that? And there's a whole mess behind the scenes, quite honestly, when it comes to and what a college prioritizes, especially in building a diverse class and the college admissions process. But I think, just as importantly, if not more importantly, there's larger societal systems at play, especially in the K-12 educational system, right? And so what I learned in coursework, but also in the day-to-day, is that students don't have equal access to resources, information, social capital, financial resources, right? It largely depends on what family you're born into. It depends on what zip code you're coming from. It depends on what public school you're assigned to, or if your parents can send you to private school. And all of that will influence K-12 education and ultimately kind of the higher ed journey, right? And so I think about the inequity within the system, and I think about the different types of schools that I walked into, and asking the questions either in the admissions committee or just in the daily work. Does this school have high quality teaching and learning? Can they compensate teachers or counselors or staff at a level that keeps folks? Or is there sort of this revolving door in the school? What does that social network look like? And do you have access to highly valued social capital, right? So we talk about, like, why do you go to maybe Ivies? And it's not necessarily just about the education that an institution provides. It's the access to those networks, and this is sort of that hidden curriculum that we find in college that some of us know about, and some of us don't really know about, right? So walking into doing kind of this admissions work and recruiting, I was walking into some of the wealthiest high schools in the entire world. I mean, we are talking about high schools where in their horse carriages for equestrian
right, because everybody has one of those, right?
horses have Tempur-Pedic mattresses. I mean, that is the kind of wealth that we're talking about. And what comes with that wealth? It comes with an entire team of college counselors. It comes with consultants that work for the school to help the college counselors write letters of recommendation or build college profiles or whatnot. And these are staff members in the college counseling office that have attended or worked at the most selective institutions in the country, right? So there's this very insular community that happens at really affluent schools. And then the other half of my job, or hopefully more than half of my job, because quite honestly, like we educate most of our students in public schools in the United States, is walking into some of the poorest neighborhoods in the country. You know, Northeast Philadelphia and the Kensington area, rural Pennsylvania, you know, inner city Phoenix or Oakland, California, the Mississippi Delta. I mean, that says nothing about, you know, worldwide and what you're seeing across the board. And these are, you know, places with concentrated poverty and sometimes violence. And you're walking into a school where, you know, the teachers might be quitting because of poor pay, and how that affects the college admissions process. If a school in Philadelphia, for example, can't keep a physics teacher, but physics is required for your engineering program, well, that certainly relates to preparation at no fault of the students. And so in the work that I was doing, I was meeting with incredibly caring and thoughtful school counselors across the board, whether it was the wealthy schools, the poor schools, in between. But a lot of the lower income schools were vastly under-resourced. And so you have this dynamic where they're serving hundreds and hundreds of students across the economic spectrum. And it's honestly really, really difficult. And that's kind of where equity comes in. How do we provide an equitable experience in K-12 schools so that everyone has access to those types of opportunities and knowledge? And I think that, you know, in order to do that, and I love that your audience it's diverse, I imagine, but at least board members are thinking about this. We need that multi-tiered, equitable approach so that every single learner has access to those conversations, not just those that have parents that went to college.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I really love that we're having this conversation, and thanks for sharing your insights. I think, you know, with Delaware, I think there's a consensus that we want to improve public education in Delaware. I think we're focused on a short-term indicator in the larger trajectory of life of, you know, proficiency levels right now. But I think you're raising a very important point that it goes beyond that, and these experiences that school boards and districts are providing children at the K-12 is not limited to the impact is not limited to when they turn 18. It is actually predicting in some ways, or controlling or influencing the trajectory that child will have, because they're competing with all of these other groups of students. Yeah, I think it's a really important point. So I think we agree that, you know, it's great to talk about this. I mean, raising awareness, right? That's the first part for solving a problem. So it's, you know, no one's fault. Great to bring it to the table. But to switch to transition to the second topic I wanted to discuss with you is a lot. You mentioned it earlier, but I'm going to pull that thread through about the work of counselors and these individuals who are tasked with helping high school students navigate that. That was part of your own personal experience.
Yeah.
You're saying you saw it when you went to these, you know, very different environments. Can you talk a little bit about, and I was a counselor, I'll tell you, I was a guidance counselor. So, you know, I think this role is very important in a middle school. I wasn't in high school, but let's talk a little bit about what you've seen and what are some best practices that boards might be able to kind of look to figure out what they want their policies to be.
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of different sort of models out there. And I think that something that works really well when it comes to college admissions and ensuring that students have access to the type of knowledge is focused on the staffing and resources within a school, right? So what we know is that the American Counselor Association basically recommends about a 250 student to one counselor ratio. We also know that public schools are competing with private schools in a lot of ways, and private schools have immense resources because of tuition dollars. And so they can get that ratio down to like 40 or 50 students for every one counselor, right? And there's usually this divide as well between socio-emotional counseling at a private school and college counseling. And there's a whole team dedicated just to college and career counseling and apprenticeships and whatever the outcomes might be. In Delaware, it's about 430 students for every one student or for every one counselor. And it's been really consistent over the past at least 2 decades or so. And so you see that, right? You see places that are either private or charter with different resources, the Callaways, the Charter School of Wilmington, that sort of thing, competing for time and attention and outcomes with DuPont, with other schools, right? And these are serving really different populations, and so there needs to be that sort of equitable approach. If you're a high school serving half students that are students of color and a quarter that or a third that are on receiving free or reduced lunch, that's a really different approach, right? And I walked into some of these schools. I walked into a Cap Callaway, and I had a room full of students. And these students have incredible outcomes, and they're competing across the board for this finite number of seats. And I'm talking about the selective admissions realm. Certainly it's much more expansive than that. But that's sort of a different approach. I think one thing that I saw was in the state of Minnesota. The state of Minnesota, across the board at public schools, implemented almost this private situation. So what I mean by that is that they had a dedicated team of school counselors, but they also had a college and career specialist, someone who was hired that knew all about that kind of specialized knowledge. And quite honestly, we could use specialists just in financial aid. I mean, is that complicated? When we talk about need-based and merit-based scholarships and college affordability, especially for limited income students. This is the kind of scenario that Brandywine High School also has. And it's something that I think really affects the way that admission representatives can visit high schools, the way that students are supported in this search process, where you do rely on your your school counselor to write a recommendation to get to know you as much as they can. But this professional can dedicate a lot of time to the college search and selection process. And I think that works pretty well.
That's really interesting. I had no idea of the ratio, so that's really important data to share. There was only one guidance counselor when I was at AI Middle, and there were about 750 students. Now, mind you, I wasn't doing college, but I had to get all the 8th graders had to get course placements. But your placement in algebra in 9th grade correlated to where you're going post graduation. So. Anyway,
and something about middle school, actually, like research shows that if you're not developing college aspirations by the time you're in 8th grade, you are far likely to go to college, right? And so honestly, even though the logistics of college admissions doesn't start in middle school, the dream big, the explore, the type of careers that we can explore and what needs a college education, what needs a 2-year, like those inklings, those sort of nuggets really begin in middle school. And so, I think that that's incredibly important in this conversation. I imagine that, you have school board members that represent the entire district, not just high schools. And so they need to know some of that information and how important that is.
Yeah. We did a shout out to Melva Ware, Dr. Melva Ware, who was at University of Delaware, who run the Europe program. That was a great assist for AI middle students. But can we talk a little bit about the specialized knowledge that some of these counselors have? How do they get that?
Yeah, so what a lot of folks don't actually know is that when you're in a master's degree program, preparing to become a school counselor, especially in high school, these programs are not all requiring knowledge about college admissions and financial aid. When I got my doctorate from Penn, I reached out, I said, I want to do something beyond kind of my day-to-day. I'm really interested in teaching. I don't want to be a full-time professor, but I want to do something. I have this degree, why not use it? And I reached out to 15 Philly area school counseling programs, graduate programs. And I said, listen, I'll do anything. I'll do a brown bag lunch. I'll join staff and do an adjunct class. I'll Zoom in, like whatever you need me to do. I would love to share my knowledge about college admissions. And only one got back to me. And that was Rowan University, a regional comprehensive in New Jersey. And they said, why don't we just hire you? This is a gap in our program. We don't have a class like this. So I taught a class called College Access for Underserved Students and I taught this for years. It was only 2 weekends. It was 10 contact hours. And I was supposed to share everything that I know about college admissions and financial aid and scholarships for underserved students in 10 hours. And most of my students, interestingly enough, were first generation. Were low income in this process. They went to under-resourced high schools. They went to regional comprehensive public institutions as colleges. And so we are placing those trained counselors back into typically under-resourced public schools. That's where Rowan usually is sending folks. They're staying in South Jersey, et cetera. And we're expecting these counselors just to know about building a balanced college list, the need-based financial aid, when they themselves struggled with this and still struggle with it when they're in graduate school, right? There's something wrong with that equation. And so what I think we should be doing is we should ensuring that all graduate programs that are preparing school counselors have something like that, have some kind of college admissions and financial aid course. Another thing, and this directly relates to your audience, is investing in professional development. So we have annual conferences, we have regional conferences. They're all college admissions, and it's school counselors and regional admission officers and college access organizations like my own. And we see very few public school counselors there unless you're on the main line, unless you're highly resourced and you're able to afford a trip to Columbus, Ohio, or Western Pennsylvania or whatnot. And that's a major gap. We need to be able to provide that professional development for school counselors so they know when college representatives reach out and they want to meet with their students, they know what that means. They know that that's actually an important experience, that they also meet with their college representative. They know what questions to ask and how to guide them, because that perspective from various colleges is so important when they're helping a student figure out what 2,000 colleges you should be applying to, and what institutions are going to be more affordable for you, and what's going to help you lead to a better career outcome. So, those kinds of things are really critically important in this process.
Yeah, I agree. And it's much better than the book that you got.
That's right.
That's
right.
It's not
today, right? Like there's so many.
Oh, you get the internet. That clears it up.
I'm not saying back in the late 90s there was no internet, but it wasn't used in the same way as today.
Right.
But like I think what's happening right now is that there's so much information out there.
Sure.
And parents and students and counselors don't know where to look, right? So I'm actually launching a small business, and it's called AskDrHoffman.com, and it's going to be coursework. Sort of like this whole curriculum that teaches folks about college admissions and financial aid, and you can do it asynchronously and you can do it on your own pace, but it's someone who's been in the room, who's had that experience. I'm launching that next month, so it's not ready yet. But
well, congratulations, that's exciting.
Thank you.
Let us know when you do. We'll push it out.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. So, but to your other point about the training and professional development, I mean, that is central to what First Aid Educate is trying to do. I mean, there's no harm, no foul. It's no one's born knowing everything. You get into these roles and you don't know. And ongoing learning is just, it's kind of like part and parcel to what life is like today. 100%. Information is evolving. So we want to launch, well, we're getting ready to, we've opened it to the new candidates, but we have a knowledge hub where we want to draw people from various backgrounds, people who might want to run for a school board position, community members who want to know more, and seated school board members to be able to, sign up, learn about, ethical decision making, or learn about financial management, or, there's just so much to know to be able to do these. And now, we could talk about adding something around college admissions, that would be neat. So great. So
I think what's important there, right, for school board members is to think about it's not about like how many students do we send to the IBs or whatnot. That's not what we're referring to. But it is tracking what percentage of our freshmen want to go to college, and then how are we doing at the end of 4 years, right? And then how does that differ for students based on race or gender or socioeconomic status? And like, what kind of interventions are we employing in these schools so that we are reaching, like, if students and parents want a specific outcome of high school and then they're not reaching it, like, that's an issue. And so I think that's where policymakers and school board members come in.
Yeah, I like the idea of metrics, and being able to compare and disaggregating them too is very important. So to move us into our third and final section, you've worked with boards too in your roles, right? The admissions, it's not like you were just sort of a free actor, could out there do anything you wanted. There was a board involved in your professional life. And could you just share a little bit with the audience about what was it like for you to work with boards, and what do you think, what works really well, and what are some things where there's opportunities?
Yeah, so I worked with the board of managers at Swarthmore. I was one of the admissions staff. I would attend with the dean, and we would often present to the board. And this is a large board. This is like 40 individuals. We had a small committee that focused on admissions and financial aid policy as well. But my role was really informing the decision makers on admissions policy and how we are implementing that policy. And there were certain things that they just needed to know. They needed to understand how U.S. immigration policy affects our international students, our undocumented students on campus, and what kind of intervening they needed to do. Do they need to allocate additional resources to support those students, right? So one of the big goals of the Swarthmore board back when I started in 2015 was to increase the number of first-generation and low-income students on campus. But you can't do that without supporting them while they're there as well. And so ensuring that they know that type of information, I think, was really important. We also dealt with policies that are big and weighty, right? So legacy is a major policy that selected institutions are dealing with. We had a legacy policy. Essentially, the children and grandchildren of alumni were given preference in the admissions process. I don't personally agree that you should have preference just based on what family you were born into, but Swarthmore did. And I think it was important for the board to understand the impact of that policy, right? I couldn't always tell them the impact. They had to ask the right questions to get to that impact, right? And so I think that's so critical in the work that boards are doing, is asking the right questions and getting to the outcome that you want to get to, right? So as long as boards could ask, like, how does our legacy policy affect our larger goal of increasing first generation low income students, right? Ask that type of question. I was able to answer it. I would talk about the zero sum game of admissions. I talk about there's a different selection process of being admitted as a legacy versus all other students, and how you're competing in all of these other spaces versus a higher admit rate for our legacy students, right? And so it was challenging working with the board because as a staff person, I couldn't always give my personal opinion. That wasn't really my role to do, but I was able to respond to thoughtful questions. I think preparation for board service is so important.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you say from the staff, the person who's on staff supporting the board, needing to withhold your own personal opinion and, understand what is the data telling you, what are the policies telling you. But I think the same is true, definitely for K-12 boards, where there are many people who get into that position were initially motivated by an issue. They cared about special education. They cared about sports, and so they were passionate, and that motivated them, which I think that's great. But once you're in that seat, taking off that hat, to quote my friend Jim Taylor, you have to put on your hat for the greater good, right? And you have to really have this ability to separate personal self from the responsibility you have in that role.
That's right. I agree 100%.
But I think it takes it's not a natural thing. You know what I mean? That's where we go back to the professional development. We have to develop that muscle. That's not something that we've been taught.
Totally.
Definitely not in school.
No, I agree. I think the importance here, when you're sitting on a board and you're representing a diverse constituency and there's a lot of issues, right? I don't think the expectation is that you're going to be an expert on everything.
Exactly.
But I think being able to like dive in and prepare and be prepared, right? So like my husband is sitting on lots of nonprofit boards. And he is one of the most prepared people that I've ever experienced when it comes to board service. And that's the type of person, right? Like, he might not know a ton about budget audits, but he's gonna do his research and he's gonna be prepared. I've worked with lots of politicians that serve on committees and boards, and several of them are just not prepared for that role. And, they roll up and they either sit silent, or even worse, they ask questions that they're not prepared to ask. And so I think making sure that you're doing that preparation, making sure that you are exposed to diverse viewpoints and perspectives also is really important, right? And so we want to ensure that you're getting good information. That doesn't always mean that you're just talking to senior staff at the school district level. It means that you also talk to frontline folks. It means that you might spend some time in schools. You might spend some time with your stakeholders and to better understand what that perspective really might be.
Yes, 1,000%. Andrew, your dedication to making systems more accessible and promoting equity and taking your own personal experience and what you were able to accomplish and removing those barriers for others is really, really admirable. It resonates with me personally. You're clear. You've shared great perspective. I think, just to summarize some of your points, the quality of educators and the access to social capital for K-12, understanding the impact of what happens in K-12 beyond K-12, this ratio that we need to be at 1 to 250, really 1 to 50, and that specialized knowledge, that was fabulous. And these last points about informing the boards and how policy impacts goals and knowing how to ask the right questions. All of this is incredibly helpful for me to hear from you, and I know for our audience has benefited greatly. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it.
Okay, and to our listeners, thank you for joining us for another episode of the Leading Together podcast. We will see you next time.